Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I should say good morning to our attendees who are joining us from the US. Welcome to this webinar on how to integrate privacy into your ISO 27701 ISMS. My name is Alice Turley, and I will be your host for the duration of this webinar. I'm a data protection, information security and compliance consultant and trainer with IT Governance Europe. My background is in compliance, data protection and consumer protection in the insurance, advertising and education sectors across the last 20 plus years. If you've been on any of my webinars before, you'll recognise this slide. For anyone that is new, IT Governance is a company that has grown very substantially to become a global one-stop shop for everything to do with data protection, information security and GDPR. This means we provide services not just to do with data protection and information security, but also with business continuity, incident management, penetration testing, PCI DSS, cyber resilience, IT service management and project management. We are a single entity that you can go to get everything that you might need in order to get yourself ISO 27001 and 27701 compliant with a package of products and services that are appropriate for your organisation. We work with organisations of all sizes in all sectors and all parts of the world. So a lot of what I'm saying in this webinar today is definitely drawn from experience of the last 16, 17 years and the thousands of organisations that we have worked with to tackle data protection and information security projects. So on to today's discussion. Firstly, today we are going to have a look at the new PIMS standard, ISO 27701. PIMS stands for Privacy Information Management System. Secondly, we will consider the structure of the standard, as well as the controls and guidance that it provides. Moving on then, I will address what an ISO 27701 implementation will mean for your business. And we will consider some of the main benefits to your organisation and your clients by having an ISO 27701 compliant PIMS in place. Finally, we conclude by looking at the next steps that you can take in order to implement PIMS into the ISMS within your organisation. Remember, ISMS stands for Information Security Management System. Today I'll be talking for about 40 to 45 minutes and you will have an opportunity at the end of the webinar to pose questions. Everyone is muted during the presentation in order to remove background noise. So if you have any questions you would like to ask during the webinar, please use the questions function in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. You will see a box marked questions, and if you open that box you can type your question in here during the webinar. When we get to the Q&A section then at the end, I will read out the questions and share the answers for everybody, and I'll aim to get through as many questions as possible in the time that we have available. So let's start now by looking at ISO 27701, the standard itself. Just to note, I will be talking about both standards, that is the 27001 and the 27701, quite a bit during this webinar. So to save on confusion, I will refer to the 27001 standard as the ISMS standard and the 27701 standard as the PIMS standard. While the ISMS standard, which provides requirements for an information security management system, is widely known, the PIMS standard is a relatively new and thus lesser known standard at the moment. The standard was developed by an ISO technical committee with input from around 49 national standards bodies, 29 observers and around 25 external liaison bodies, including the European Data Protection Board. It is a privacy extension to the ISMS standard, and this is important to note. So as an organisation, you cannot become PIMS certified unless you have already certified with an ISMS standard or you are implementing both ISMS and a PIMS together. The PIMS standard is based on the requirements, control objectives and controls of an ISMS, but it focuses on privacy-specific requirements. So its requirements concentrate on implementing, maintaining and continually improving a PIMS. Helpfully, the standard itself includes a definition of a PIMS. So PIMS stands for a Privacy Information Management System. It is an information security system which addresses the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PI. And PI is personally identifiable information, very similar to the GDPR's personal data. It's information that can be used to identify an individual. The main aim of a PIMS is to manage all privacy risks to an acceptable and consistent level, with top management determining the level of risk that is acceptable to the organisation. Data privacy, however, is more than just the GDPR. So this PIMS standard is designed to work across data protection legislation, guidance and codes across the globe. It's designed to cover all privacy obligations. Some organisations may choose to implement the ISMS and PIMS standards in order to benefit from the best practice that they contain, while others may decide that they want to get certified to reassure customers and clients that they are following the recommendations of both standards. The standard applies the terms and definitions that are given in ISO 27000 and ISO 29100. So legislation and regulation around the world requires organisations to take measures to ensure the protection of any personal data that they process. Legislation such as the General Data Protection Regulation, that is the GDPR, the Data Protection Acts, or the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, they're all about protecting the personal data of individuals and protecting an individual's rights in relation to their personal data. However, none of these laws provide supportive guidance on what these measures should actually be in practice. So ISO and IEC have developed this new PIMS standard to provide this guidance. The GDPR refers frequently to the need for appropriate technical and organisational measures. And while an ISMS can help an organisation to demonstrate considerable compliance with appropriate technical measures, a PIMS will be able to assist an organisation to demonstrate significant compliance with organisational measures. So a company that has both standards successfully implemented will go a long way towards being able to demonstrate their compliance with the GDPR. The PIMS standard was published in August 2019, so it's still relatively new. There are some differences in terminology, which you can see here. So the PIMS standard refers to PI as opposed to personal data. What we would consider as processors and controllers under the GDPR are called PI controllers and PI processors under the PIMS standard. And not to be confused with the 6 data protection principles, a data subject is referred to as a PI principal. PI is a recognised term for processing personal data in the US. And remember, this is a PIMS standard, or this PIMS standard is an international standard. And so it needs to use terms recognised at an international level. Data privacy, as I mentioned before, is more than just the GDPR. So this PIMS standard is designed to work across data protection legislation, guidance and codes across the globe. It's designed to cover all privacy obligations. In considering your privacy obligations, you therefore need to consider what is contained within your privacy universe. For example, you will need to ensure you adhere to your obligations under general legislation, such as the GDPR, and your local national data privacy legislation. Here in Ireland, we have the Data Protection Act 2018, and the UK also has a Data Protection Act 2018, as do many other countries. This is normally the local data privacy legislation that may have been updated to implement some of the GDPR's derogations or to bring it in line with the GDPR. Other legislation that needs to be considered to see what impact it has on your organisation is the e-privacy regulation, the LED and the CCPA. These are just examples of some privacy legislation that's in existence. The e-privacy regulation is currently at draft stage, but it will replace the current e-privacy directive and it will complement the GDPR's general rules on personal data processing by providing specific rules governing electronic communications. As such, the e-privacy regulation will take precedent over the GDPR in situations where both laws apply. Note as well, unlike the GDPR, the e-privacy regulation does not apply to just personal data. It also affects, for instance, business-to-business marketing. The LED is the Law Enforcement Directive. This is a piece of EU legislation parallel to the GDPR. It also had effect from the 25th of May 2018, and as suggested by its name, the LED deals with the processing of personal data by data controllers for law enforcement purposes, which fall outside of the scope of the GDPR. The CCPA is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which gives consumers more control over the personal information that businesses collect about them. This law forces companies to provide more information to consumers about what's being done with their data and gives them more control over the sharing of the data. As well as specialised and general legislation, you may also have privacy obligations imposed on you via contracts or via codes of practice or via standards like ISO 27701. Or via other sectorial requirements, such as, for example, the Consumer Protection Act here in Ireland for the financial services industry. The PIMS standard is designed to work across all these obligations within your privacy universe. So I've given you a little overview of the PIMS standard and why it was developed. Now I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at the structure of the standard as well as some of the controls. So as the PIMS standard is a bolt-on standard to the ISMS one, it is helpful to look at the structure of the ISMS standard before outlining the structure of the PIMS one, particularly for those of you that already have an ISMS in place. The structure of a PIMS differs slightly from the structure of an ISMS. So here you can see the structure of the ISMS standard. And you'll recognise the standard management clauses of 4, which is context of the organisation, through to 10, which is improvement, with Annex A following up. Now we take a look at the structure of 27,701. So you can see straight away the structure is different to the ISMS standard. The main content of this standard is contained within clauses 5 through to 8. But let me show you how these link to the ISMS. So taking clause 5 first, this links to the management clauses of 4 through to 10 in the ISMS standard. So the requirements in clause 5 here link with the requirements in clauses 4 to 10 here, with some new requirements imposed by the PIMS. Clause 6 links with the 14 control categories and 114 controls that are contained within Annex A of the ISMS standard. The guidance for implementing these controls is contained within another standard, ISO 27002. Clause 6 considers each of the 14 control categories, and it introduces new PIM-specific guidance in all but one of these control categories. The final 2 clauses in the PIMS standard, clauses 7 and 8, provide additional privacy-specific guidance for PI controllers and PI processors respectively. This guidance covers the areas of collecting and processing PI, the obligations of PI controllers and PI processors, the obligations that they have to PI principals, privacy by design and by default, as well as guidance in relation to the sharing, transfer and disclosing of PI. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide that Annex A refers to PIM-specific controls for PI controllers and Annex B to the PIM-specific controls for PI processors. So let us look at clauses 5 and 6 in a little bit more detail now. So you can see on this slide that the requirements in clause 5 mirror the set of requirements in ISO 27001. So where clause 5.2 here of the PIM standard refers to context of the organisation, this was clause 4 in the ISMS standard. Clause 5.4 in the PIM standard refers to planning, whereas clause 6 in the ISMS standard refers to planning, etc. The items shown in red are where requirements additional to 27001 are specified. So, for example, one such new requirement under clause 5.2 context is that when considering the scope of the information security system, the organisation must include the processing of PI. In reality, that means that an organisation's scope statement must take privacy into account. Another example would be when determining the needs and expectations of interested parties. The organisation must include those parties that have interests or responsibilities associated with the processing of PI. A further example of a new requirement, this time under clause 5.4 planning, is that the statement of applicability must either be updated to include the PIMS controls from Annex A and Annex B of the PIMS standard, or that a second statement of applicability must be produced containing the PIMS controls from Annex A and Annex B of the PIMS standard. In addition, the organisation must apply a privacy risk assessment process to identify risks related to the processing of PI within the scope of the PIMS. This means extending an organisation's existing risk management framework to ensure risks relating to the processing of PI are assessed. You will notice that I've started this slide with clause 5.2, and you might wonder what clause 5.1 relates to. Well, 5.1 is a general requirement stating that the requirements of 27001 mentioning information security shall be extended to the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PI. So essentially, this means that anywhere you use the term information security in your ISMS, it should be extended to mean information security and privacy. Looking at clause 6 specifically now, you will recognise the 14 control categories that are contained within Annex A of the ISMS standard, from information security policies right through to compliance number 18. As mentioned earlier, there is only one control category which has not been provided with additional guidance, and that category is Annex A17, which relates to business continuity management. The numbers noted in red font on this slide signify the additional guidance provided within clause 6 of the PIMS standard. I don't have time today, unfortunately, to take a look at each of these additional guidance clauses with you, but I will outline a few here now. So, for example, in Annex A5, which in an ISMS refers to having an information security policy, under clause 6.2.1.1 of the PIMS standard, there is guidance to develop a separate privacy policy or to augment the existing information policy to show commitment to achieving PI compliance. Another example would be in clause 6.3.1.1 of the PIMS standard, where the PIMS is requiring that there is a designated point of contact for PI principals regarding the processing of PI. PIMS refers to data subjects as PI principals, so you can see how this could link into the GDPR, with the designated point of contact being the data protection officer. A further example would be in clause 6.13.1.1, which advises that the existing ISMS incident management policy should be expanded to specify the PI response and that responsibilities for the notification of a PI breach should be established. I mentioned on an earlier slide that clauses 7 and 8 of the PIMS standard provide additional guidance for PI controllers and PI processors. Well, Annex A of the PIMS standard contains 31 controls for PI controllers, and Annex B of the standard contains 18 controls for PI processors. These controls are separated into the same 4 categories that you see here in the bullet points. So, conditions for collection and processing, obligations to PI principals, privacy by design and privacy by default, and PI sharing, transfer and disclosure. So let me outline, to give you a flavour, some of the controls for PI controllers in Annex A. So Annex A 7.2.2 refers to the requirement for PI controllers to identify the lawful basis of the PI processing. Annex A 7.2.4 refers to carrying out of privacy impact assessments. Annex 7.3.3 deals with how information should be provided to PI principals. And Annex A 7.4.7 deals with retention. And Annex 7.5.1 outlines the obligations a PI controller has to identify the basis for PI transfer between jurisdictions. Anyone who's very familiar with GDPR will be recognising an awful lot of GDPR in what I've just said there. But what about some of the controls for PI processors? These are outlined in Annex B. So Annex B Point 8.2.1 outlines the controls in relation to consumer agreements. Annex B 8.4.2 deals with PI processors' obligations in relation to returning, transferring or disposing of PI. Annex B 8.5.1 sets requirements which are the basis for PI transfers between jurisdictions. So those just give you a flavour of some of the obligations that are outlined in both Annex A and Annex B. But as I said earlier, if you're in any ways familiar with the GDPR, you will recognise all of these controls, and it's kind of clear that they have originated from the GDPR. I should point out at this stage the controls in Annex A and Annex B of the PIMS standard are in addition to the controls already that you would already be familiar with in Annex A of the ISMS standard. So now that we've looked at the structure and some of the controls and guidance contained within the PIMS standard, let us now consider how you can implement this PIMS 27701 standard within your organisation. So an ISMS helps organisations keep data accurate, available and accessible only to approved employees. A PIMS manages the way organisations collect personal data and helps them prevent unauthorised use or disclosure of sensitive information. An organisation has two options when it comes to the PIMS standard. Considering option A first, any organisations that have already implemented an ISMS will be able to use the PIMS to extend their security efforts to cover privacy management, including their processing of personal or PI data, which can help them then demonstrate that reasonable measures have been taken to comply with data privacy laws such as the GDPR. Option B is for organisations without an existing ISMS, who can implement both the ISMS and the PIMS standards together as a single implementation project. I must emphasise here, you cannot implement the PIMS standard as a standalone certification. You must either have the ISMS standard in place already, or you must implement both standards in tandem. And as I mentioned, I did mention clause 5.1 on an earlier slide, and this is the general requirement stating that the requirements of 27001 mentioning information security must be extended to the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PI. This essentially means that anywhere you use the term information security in your ISMS, it should be extended to mean information security and privacy. Therefore, if you are implementing the PIMS standard and you already have an existing ISMS in place, you need to completely review your existing ISMS and extend it to include privacy. This means reviewing your scope, extending your risk management framework to include privacy, amending your existing statement of applicability or creating a separate one for privacy, reviewing all policies, procedures, training and monitoring material within your ISMS and updating them to ensure that they mean and include privacy. Clause 6.1 of the PIMS standard is also a general note, and this instead refers to the guidelines in ISO 27002. So as you may be aware, the 27002 standard gives guidelines and recommendations on implementing the 114 controls of Annex A in the 27001 standard. You cannot actually be certified to 27002, it's a guidance standard. In saying that, Clause 6.1 of the PIMS standard mentions that information security should be extended to the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PI, and that all control objectives and controls should be considered in the context of both risks to information security as well as risks to privacy relating to the processing of PI. So what does this mean for you? Well, if you already have an existing ISMS in place, you need to consider all controls implemented to meet the obligations of Annex A 2007 and extend these controls if need be to ensure risks to privacy related to the processing of PI are addressed, as well as your information security risks. For example, Annex A 15.1.2 of the ISMS standard refers to addressing security within supplier or processor agreements. Clause 6.12.1.2 of the PIMS standard recommends that you should specify in agreements with suppliers or processors whether PI is processed, and the minimum technical and organisational measures that the supplier needs to meet. Speaking actually of suppliers and processors, these days many organisations have moved to using cloud-based technology. If you are one of these organisations, you may want to consider implementing ISO 27018, which is the code of practice for the protection of PI in public clouds acting as PI processors. This slide is summarising the controls you need to consider when implementing the PIMS standard. So you have the PIMS specific requirements relating to the ISMS standard 27001, you have the PIMS specific guidance relating to 27002, as well as the new guidance controls for PI controllers and PI processors, which are outlined in Annex A and Annex B of the PIMS standard. As anyone who has implemented 27001 before is aware, it is so important to determine your ISMS scope from the outset of your implementation. Similarly, with the PIMS standard, it is imperative that you review your existing scope and define it in such a manner that it includes the processing of PI. Keeping in mind that under clause 5.2.1, you need to determine if your organisation is acting as a PI controller, a PI processor, or both, as this will determine the set of controls that you must apply. I have highlighted, or I've mentioned, I should say, on this slide, some of the key components of a privacy information management system. Privacy notices tell individuals what data you are gathering, how you are processing it, what your lawful basis is for that processing, the purpose of the processing, and how long you intend to retain it for. A privacy notice may be referred to as a privacy statement or sometimes a fair processing statement, but it should not be confused with a privacy policy. A privacy policy is more an internal statement that covers an organisation or entity's handling of personal information. It is directed at the members of the organisation and the employees who might handle or make decisions regarding the personal information, instructing them on the collection, use, storage and destruction of the data, as well as any specific rights the data subject or PI principals may have. This is also referred to as a data protection policy. The GDPR sets out 6 data protection principles that must be adhered to. So these are: personal data must be processed lawfully, fairly, in a transparent manner. It should be collected for specified, explicit and legitimate purposes. The processing should be adequate, relevant and limited to what is necessary. Personal data should be accurate and, where necessary, kept up to date. It should be retained only for as long as is necessary, and it should be processed in an appropriate manner to maintain security. So organisations outside of the scope of GDPR are likely to have their own somewhat similar privacy principles, depending on the country that they are in. The GDPR also defines 6 lawful bases for processing, and in order to process personal data in a compliant manner, an organisation must have one of these 6 lawful bases. So processing of personal data is lawful if you have the consent of the individual, where the processing is necessary to meet contractual or legal obligations, where the processing is necessary to protect the vital interests of the individual or for tasks carried out in the public interest, or where processing is for the purposes of the legitimate interests of the controller. An extremely important part of the PIMS are the processes and procedures in place to ensure you are meeting individuals' rights. For example, have you a process in place to recognise and respond to an individual's request for information, to an erasure request, to a portability request? What processes do you have in place to ensure that you are not retaining PI data for longer than is necessary? And how is personal data or PI disposed of? Do you have appropriate controls in place to securely transmit PI data to third parties and across borders? Does your existing change management process ensure that changes to data processing are controlled? Do you implement privacy by design and by default? Essentially, the obligation of privacy by design and by default is to process in the least intrusive manner possible, by limiting the amount and range of information collected and processed, as well as the number of people having access to it. So privacy by design and by default also means using the most secure means of processing to complete the activity. So for example, there should be appropriate technical security controls safeguarding the data both in transit and at rest in your systems. Pseudonymization is one such recognized security technique under the GDPR. By implementing a PIMS, you are seeking to minimize the risks associated with PI processing, and therefore can offer greater assurance to your clients and employees that their personal information will be appropriately protected from the threat of unauthorized disclosure, loss, theft, etc. This slide lists different data privacy policies and procedures, all of which are considered processes within the PIMS. But they are not necessarily all needed for each organisation. It will depend on the nature of the processing, the risk, the size and structure of each organisation. I should point out this list is not exhaustive. A large organisation may need more processes than what is shown here, or a small organisation obviously may require less. It is important to note that an organisation's training and awareness programme is considered a key part of the PIMS. After all, there is no point in having the most secure technology and the best written processes in the world if no one is aware of the processes nor knows how to use or read the technology. And this leads me on to my next slide. In order for your PIMS to be effective, employees and contractors must be aware of the PIMS policies and procedures. They must understand what is expected of them, and they must realise what the implications are if they do not adhere to the PIMS policies and procedures. Employees should be kept up to date on any changes to the PIMS. They should be able to demonstrate their compliance with the PIMS and should receive regular training on PIMS processes and procedures. Clause 6.4.2.1 of the PIMS standard states that measures should be put in place, including awareness of incident reporting, to ensure that relevant staff are aware of the possible consequences to the organisation, to the staff member, and to the PI principle of breaching privacy or security rules and procedures, especially those addressing the handling of PI. Anyone who is familiar with the GDPR will be aware of the pseudo 7th data protection principle, which outlines that you must be able to demonstrate your compliance with each of the 6 data protection principles. It's also called the accountability principle. Well, it's the same here. As part of the PIMS standard, you must be able to demonstrate the level of training, education and awareness that your employees have. And this can be evidenced via results of training, knowing and showing the percentage of employees that have passed their training, keeping a record of education and training certificates on employees' files, the organization's training materials, communication emails, bulletins, newsletters, minutes of team meetings, etc. They're all methods of demonstrating how the PIMS has and is being communicated throughout the organization. A privacy compliance framework, or PCF, is a structured approach to privacy management and accountability. In general, a privacy management framework is an implementation roadmap which provides structure and checklists, including documented processes and procedures to guide privacy professionals through privacy management. A PCF is an example of a structured approach to privacy management based on the nationally and internationally recognized standards for personal information and information security management. So in simple terms, a correctly implemented PCF encapsulates all 3 elements shown in the box here to deliver embedded compliance. So it links the governance and internal control framework to the PIMS, to the ISMS and to the data protection principles. The key objectives of a PCF are to protect the confidentiality, integrity and availability of information assets, including your personal data, to protect the rights of individuals, to maintain compliance with relevant legislation, as well as meeting contractual requirements and the obligations of any applicable codes of practice. So you have chosen to implement the PIMS standard in line with your existing ISMS or in tandem with your ISMS implementation. What benefits do you hope to gain? Or what benefits will you gain? Well, firstly, your clients will feel reassured that you have the appropriate policies and procedures in place to ensure that their personal information, as well as the personal data of their customers that they have entrusted you with, will be managed safely. Secondly, as the PIMS standard addresses the security of personally identifiable information, a 27,701 compliant organisation will be able to demonstrate their compliance with respective privacy laws and regulations from around the globe. Recital 81 of the GDPR states, the adherence of the processor to an approved code of conduct or an approved certification mechanism may be used as an element to demonstrate compliance with the obligations of the controller. Thirdly, use of the PIMS standard should reduce the complexity of your compliance projects. You will use privacy impact assessments, or PIAs, and the risk management framework in order to highlight and manage privacy risks. Using PIAs in the early stages of the project has significant benefits in highlighting privacy issues at a time when mitigation controls can still be implemented as part of the project plan, rather than at the end. Excuse me. Our next benefit states that having a PIMS compliance standard in place will save you time spent on preparing and conducting privacy audits. A PIMS compliant organisation will have yearly internal audits carried out by an independent, suitably qualified person or personnel, which can be either in-house or external, as well as being subjected to regular surveillance audits carried out by the certification body. An ISMS and PIMS compliant organisation is a demonstration in itself of the organisation's commitment to information and privacy security, as well as providing assurance for stakeholders and prospective clients. An ISMS and PIMS certified organisation is able to demonstrate that it has considerable appropriate organisational and technical measures in place to protect the personal data of individuals and to meet the rights of data subjects as outlined in the GDPR or in your own national legislation. Remember, an ISO certification is internationally recognised. So we have looked now at what the PIMS standard is and its relationship to the ISMS standard. We've had a peek at the structure and some of the controls and guidance it contains, and we've considered the benefits of implementing an ISO 27701 standard. So what's next? Well, IT governance can help you in implementing, auditing, analysing and monitoring your compliance with ISO 27701. We can provide templates for all the necessary documents, a gap analysis tool and starter bundle kits. We provide specific certified training courses, the ISO 27701 PIMS Lead Implementer and the PIMS Lead Auditor courses. Both have exams at the end, both are certified to ISO 17024, and completion of each course provides you with 14 CPT points. In addition, we can provide you with consultancy-led support in order to carry out internal audits or to assist you in implementing 27701 or 27701 and 27001 within your organisation. You can contact us via any of the mediums shown here for any questions or queries that you may have after the webinar has concluded. Today's presentation is in the handout section of this webinar, which you can get there, download from there, but also the slides and the recording will be shared via email in the next few days. I would like to take this opportunity to tell you about my next webinar, which is going to focus on the practical steps to conducting an ISO 27701 gap analysis. This is scheduled for Thursday, 8th of October from 3 p.m. And during this webinar, I offer practical advice on conducting an ISO 27701 gap analysis. So it'll cover the standards compliance requirements, the mandatory documentation to achieve 27701 compliance, the questions organisations should ask when conducting a gap analysis, and how you can report on the results and measure the closure of gaps. So this brings us to the end of the prepared proportion of today's webinar. So now we will look at some of the questions received so far. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please use the questions function in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. You'll see a box there marked questions. If you open up that box, you can type your questions in here. I'm going to read each question out and answer them, and I'll aim to get through as many as possible before our time is up. Okay, so we do have quite a few questions in here already. Okay, first question here. So if you obtained ISO 27701, could you claim to be GDPR compliant? At the moment, there is no seal, privacy seal out there or GDPR seal that states you are GDPR compliant. I do believe this is something that the European Data Protection Board is currently working on. However, by implementing 27,000 and 27,701, you go a long way towards demonstrating your compliance with the organisational and technical measures that GDPR refers to. And I wouldn't be one bit surprised if the European Data Protection Board considers both of those ISO standards when they are actually developing their GDPR compliant seal. Next question. As the ISO 27701 is to cover all privacy obligations across the globe, will there be any direct conflict within the ISO 27001 where different national data protection laws vary? That is a very good question, and there could actually possibly be, but the ISO 27701 standard, while it does have an annex that includes its mapping to the GDPR, it very much does refer to the privacy obligations that are prominent within each member state or within each country. So it's quite an interesting question. I think we'd need to have more specific examples where we could actually address and see which actually takes precedence. Would you please explain the correlation among ISO, okay, and I think, okay, hold on. That's just gone on me, 1 second. Okay, so sorry, this is, can you explain the correlation among ISO 27701, CDR with corporate digital responsibility, and data accuracy? Thank you very much. So yes, so 27701 is covering your privacy obligations. I shouldn't say, it is incorporating bringing privacy with regards to the processing of PI into your already existing ISMS. It will cover corporate digital responsibility in so much that it covers the processing of PI. If an organisation has ISMS already in place, then is the PIMS charged at a full new standard rate? PIMS can't be implemented if an ISMS isn't already in place or an organisation implementing it. Okay, so you, with regards to the rates that they're charging, this is something that you would have to actually consult with the certification bodies within your own countries. And I would certainly advise you to make sure that the certification bodies you're liaising with are fully accredited to your national certification body. I am not aware of the standard rates for what they would be charged at, but I can only assume because PIMS is a bolt-on to the ISMS, I would assume that it couldn't really be charged at the same as a full certified rate. But again, that's just my personal opinion. It is something that you would need to check with the certification bodies themselves. Okay. So is it a bolt-on or a whole new standard? Yes, it is. It is a bolt-on standard. It's not a standard on its own. You must have an ISMS already, the 27701 already implemented, or you must be implementing the 27001 along with the 27701. How many organisations are PIMS certified at the moment? I honestly could not tell you. I don't work as part of the certification bodies. Again, that would be a query into the certification bodies themselves. I do know that I have quite a few clients that are in the process of being certified at the moment, and I do have a number of clients that are also going through their PIMS gap analysis in order to update their ISMS to become 27,701 as well as 27,001 certified. How can you sign up for the webinar on 8th of October? If you go on to our website, itgovernance.co.uk, and just search for ISO 27701 webinar, it should actually bring you into the webinar pages. But if not, you have our contact details on the slides, and please feel free to contact us and we can send you the link. Is ISO 27701 certification recognised within the Europe region? It's recognised internationally. It's an international standard, so it's across every country. So you mentioned ISO 27018 for companies using cloud services. However, isn't ISO 27018 only for cloud? You are correct. And sorry, I should have actually mentioned that within the slide. ISO 27018 is for cloud providers. So if you are a processor who is providing a cloud service, you should look at implementing the standard 27018. If you have a fairly well implemented ISO 27001 system, how much more effort is getting 27,701 compliant? Another 20% resources or 50%? Okay, so there's a lot of factors that you need to actually take into account when considering this. So, for example, the size and structure of the organization, the jurisdiction, I suppose, of the organization, is it across multiple jurisdictions? And you'd also need to consider the type of PI or personal data that you are processing. So are you processing a limited number of personal data, maybe just that of your employees, or are you processing considerable numbers of special categories of personal data? So those factors together would actually determine how much more effort you would need in becoming compliant. However, if you contact us directly, one of our consultants or myself can actually talk to you, and I would be able to give you a better idea from talking to you and from getting your answers to those factors. I'd be able to give you a better idea of how of the amount of resources that it would then require. Okay, with privacy requirements growing, how will this impact C-level or board responsibilities? Okay, with the fact that 27,701 is a bolt-on to 27,001, you should already have quite a lot of board responsibilities, roles and responsibilities assigned as part of your ISMS. And it's a matter of looking at those roles and responsibilities and in tandem considering the level of the processing of PI that your organization does, updating those roles and responsibilities. If you already have a well implemented ISMS, I don't see any kind of further impact as to adding in the privacy requirements. There's going to be the same level of reporting, the same level of responsibility, the same requirements to review your risk registers. It's just that your risk registers will include privacy risks. There will be the same requirement to conduct management review meetings. It's just that the management review meetings will include privacy side of things as well. And to be honest, if you are working within the remit of the GDPR, you would already have an awful lot of these responsibilities on board. How much time would a medium company need to implement 27,701? This again would depend on the type of company and the type of processing of personal data that you would actually conduct. But for a company that has a well implemented ISMS in place, I believe that 27,701 could be implemented within a period of 2 to 3 months. Have any recent COVID measures affected compliance, for example, using DocuServe, etc.? Excuse me. Yes. So it's not so much that they have affected compliance, it's just it's more a case of that compliance has to ensure that it's covering all kinds of e-processing. You've had with the COVID and restrictions on travel, etc., you've seen a lot more organisations allowing employees to work from home. So therefore, there are more controls that need to be put in place to ensure that employees are accessing organisational data in a compliant manner, ensuring the security of the information. So, for example, are employees using a secure VPN to access? Are they using laptops working from home that have been provided by the company, or are they accessing via their own devices? Are there remote policies in place that employees have been made aware of, and have and is adherence to those policies actually being checked and monitored? Again, there is an awful lot of agreements now that are being signed online, remotely, etc. So it is a matter of all of these should actually be risk assessed. They should be included on your risk register to ensure then that you are implementing appropriate controls to protect your customers, your suppliers and your employees' personal data. Okay, and last question here is, by when do you need to be certified? So there is no date for when you actually have to be certified. It's more a case of if you are going to become if you're going to implement a PIMS compliance standard, like the 27,701, you need to ensure that you have the ISMS standard in place already, and then you need to put your processes and procedures in place to ensure that you're including the processing of PI within your ISMS standards. When you engage with your certification body in order to obtain this new standard, they will give you a date for your stage 1 certification audit, and you need to have everything in place before that stage 1 audit takes place. And we have actually come to the end of all the questions. I'm just going to double check in case any have come in up at the top that I might have missed. No, so that actually brings us to the end. We've gone through all our questions there. So I would just like to thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I look forward to sharing with you on the next webinar on the 8th of October. Thank you.